record. All right, fantastic. All right, folks, welcome back for another great session of the Modjeska Simkins School of Human Rights. Tonight, of course, we have a very special presentation on the history of segregation and Jim Crow and education in South Carolina. Now, we alluded to some of this already throughout the course of the class this semester in terms of talking about things like the school desegregation campaign, school equalization, and the like. But tonight is a really important presentation that gives you further perspective on how these battles over education in the Palmetto State have shaped education, not just in this state, but all across the country. And of course, as we all know, these debates about education are still very much relevant to us in the here and now. So tonight, we have three very special guests, one of whom will join us in a moment. But right now, we have Cecil Cahoon, who of course is a new board member of the Progressive Network. He is also a regional organizer for the National Education Association. And I just want to say he has been a valuable and wonderful addition to our team here at the Modjeska School. I'm really pleased to have him speaking this evening. We also have another living legend, Dr. Millicent Brown, who's an activist, a longtime educator and historian, who is here to give both her perspective as a historian and as someone who also helped to desegregate schools in Charleston back in 1963. So those will be our first two speakers this evening. They both have some valuable insights to offer. And of course, later tonight, we will have Howard Duvall, a Columbia City Council member who will also join us as well to talk about some of the, not only legacies of the battles of education in South Carolina, but also talk a bit about home rule and how this all links together as we battle to further democratize and small de-democratize the state of South Carolina. So what I want to do now is turn the floor over to Cecil and we'll go from there. So Cecil, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Dr. Green. I'm going to.
Oh, right before that, sorry, before I forget,
Yeah.
if you have not yet paid your tuition and fees to the Modjeska School, please do so as soon as possible. You do not want to miss out on getting your copies of History Denied, the Modjeska Simkins booklet, or your t-shirt and diploma. So please make sure you pay your dues as soon as possible. Again, as I said before, and I'll reiterate this evening, this school is not possible without your full support, and we certainly appreciate it. Sorry for that, Cecil. Now the floor is yours.
Thank you, Dr. Green. I'm going to share my screen, and I'm going to move through this at a pretty quick clip this evening, but everything that you see on the screen will be shared with you through the Modjeska School and the Progressive Network. The title of the presentation is Equalization and Massive Resistance, Jimmy Burns and Marion Gressett. Let me make sure that the screen, there you go. South Carolina's unwillingness to fund public schools was nothing new when Jimmy Burns was inaugurated in 1951. A decade earlier, in 1941, Governor Burnett Maybank commissioned a study that showed 19 counties lacked a high school for Black students. Only 8 school buses carried Black children to school statewide. Maybank did nothing to address these disparities. In 1947, Governor Strom Thurmond and the legislature commissioned another statewide survey, this one overseen by the George Peabody College for Teachers in Nashville, Tennessee, and it was overseen by Dr. J.B. White, a former South Carolina superintendent. When it was released in October 1948, the Peabody studied detailed differences, what it called extreme disparity, in funding, transportation, teacher training, and school facilities in segregated schools. In 1947, South Carolina spent $221 per white pupil, only $45 per Black pupil. Few schools had been built since World War I, and you can guess who attended them. Rural schools were much worse off than urban schools were. They had variable electric service and plumbing, and of course, fewer teachers. The Peabody survey called for an investment of $90 million to improve school building facilities and bring schools closer to the national average in school buildings and equipment. That was in 1948, the year that Thurmond bolted the Democratic Party's national convention and ran for president as a Dixiecrat. He did nothing to address the Peabody study that he had commissioned. In 1950, the State House developed a minor study of its own, looking for a way to minimize the costs that were identified in the Peabody study. The legislature had not supported sales tax in the past, but in its report, State House leadership suggested Look at the words, it might support a small tax increase to fund limited school improvements. Then Jimmy Burns was inaugurated in January 1951. And within days of his inauguration, he outlined his strategy to issue bonds for school construction and to raise a 3-cent sales tax to pay for the bonds, all of which was designed to defend and preserve segregation in public schools. He made no secret of this motive. What Burns requested of the legislature, House Speaker Pro Tem Fritz Hollings was to deliver in the House, and Senate Education Chairman Marion Gressett would deliver in the Senate. First, the equalization plan. Burns interpreted the litigation brought by Black parents in Clarendon County as a threat that neither Maybank nor Thurmond had faced. He said so in a speech to the South Carolina Education Association only a few weeks into his administration. And that was based only on the litigants' request for equal transportation expenditures before they changed their brief to challenge the constitutionality of separate but equal. Burns predicted that was coming. So he said South Carolina had to show that it would address and was addressing the inequity in funding for and the number and the quality of public schools for Black students. His intention was to prevent an adverse court decision in Briggs v. Elliott. He wanted to provide evidence to the courts that separate but equal remained a valid public policy. In February 1951, he asked lawmakers to pass a $75 million bond issue for school equalization and a 3-cent sales tax to fund school construction and pay off the bonds. This was not sufficient to meet all of the needs identified in the Peabody study of 1948. That estimate was $90 million. Burns asked only for $75 million, and this was an unprecedented commitment of funding for schools. It was immediately unpopular with the public. White leaders opposed paying to educate Black children. They said they did not want to build new schools unless the court ordered it, if the court ordered it. Black and white citizens asked for food and clothes to be made tax exempt. Black citizens specifically opposed the tax because it was a response to Briggs v. Elliott. So the public hated it, and Burns faced an uphill climb with lawmakers. Legislators said it was too big, too expensive, too much emphasis on Black children. Equalization was not their legislative priority because they were not persuaded by Burns's prediction that legal segregation itself was in danger. But Burns went further than any governor had. He pledged publicly that if the legislature implemented his plan and the courts ignored this demonstration of good faith in defense of separate but equal, and if the court ultimately declared segregation in public schools was unconstitutional, he would lead the legislature to abandon its constitutional mandate to provide for public schools altogether. Then, just as Burns predicted, the Clarendon County parents changed their petition to ask not for equal schools and equipment in Somerton, but to have separate but equal overturned entirely. This change gave Burns the ammunition he needed to persuade House and Senate leaders. So 1 month before the 3-judge panel began hearing the arguments in Briggs v. Elliott in May, the legislature passed Burns's equalization proposal. 1 week later, the State Educational Finance Commission, freshly appointed to administer equalization funds, met for the first time. The sales tax would not become effective until July 1, but this commission began meeting anyway to show that it was serious about equalizing schools for little Black children. Clarendon County's attorney, Robert M. Figg, built all of this news into his defense arguments. Before I go further, I want to draw an analogy. Throughout Franklin Roosevelt's presidency, Roosevelt came to rely heavily on Jimmy Burns. Burns became indispensable. When Roosevelt needed a Senate ally, Burns was his man. When Roosevelt wanted Burns to leave the Senate and take a seat on the Supreme Court, he did it. When Roosevelt wanted Burns to leave the court and run his war mobilization effort, he did it. So it's not hyperbolic that his contemporaries called him Roosevelt's assistant president. When Burns decided to run for governor with a very specific mission in mind, he needed someone to become his own indispensable guy, his own assistant governor. And at that moment, there was no more powerful Democrat in South Carolina than Senator Marion Gressett of Calhoun County. Gressett was already a titan in the Senate, chair of the Education Committee, soon to be chair of the Judiciary Committee at the same time, soon to be elected chairman of the State Democratic Party too. So saying Burns wanted Gressett to be Burns's own Jimmy Burns is an apt analogy when you consider the assignments that Burns gave Gressett and that Gressett took. In the opening months of his term, Burns devised the second half of his 2-track plan. One track was this economic plan to equalize school funding. The other track was a legal strategy to resist court orders through statute. Burns wanted Gressett to serve as the point man on both strategies. He intended to create and appoint a 15-member special school study committee, a private council of legislators and gubernatorial appointees who were not elected officials, and he wanted Gressett to chair it. To illustrate how badly Burns wanted Gressett for this job, consider that at the same moment he appointed Marion Gressett to chair the segregation committee, Burns also appointed Gressett's brother, Tatum Gressett, the first executive director of the state's brand new consolidated retirement system for public employees and state agent for Social Security Administration. Tatum Gressett had been a football player and a coach at the Citadel in the 1920s and 30s. He had effectively retired a decade earlier in 41. He was no more qualified then to assume the leadership of the state retirement system than I am now. But putting Tatum in that position, which he held from 1951 to 1972 when he retired for good, gave him access to every public employee record in every corner of the state. And of course, it guaranteed another member of the Gressett family a state salary and a pension. So Marion Gressett accepted Burns's offer. And for the next 15 plus years, the Special School Study Committee became known as the Segregation Committee or the Gressett Committee. It functioned as a legislative committee. It produced draft legislation for introduction to the General Assembly, but with one important difference that I'll point out later when I talk about what the committee produced. In June, defense attorney Robert M. Figg won the Briggs v. Elliott case at the district level. The court ruled 2-1 that segregation was constitutional, but you already know that Briggs' appeal and some similar cases were rolled into one larger case that the Supreme Court agreed to hear. Let me explain some details of the equalization plan. It took some, but not all, of the Peabody study's recommendations from 48. It forced counties to consolidate schools and school districts, to eliminate local school boards that had fewer than 7 members, to survey the building and educational needs of their schools, and then to apply for state funding. The State Educational Finance Commission oversaw these changes and the applications. The plan did achieve some of its goals. By October 1952, 42 counties submitted plans for consolidation, replacing old boards with fewer new ones. When the consolidation plans were completed, they reduced the number of independent school districts in South Carolina from 1,220 school districts down to 102. All of this, however, continued to remain unpopular. Local school boards resented losing local control over school construction in their counties. Rural white parents also resented consolidation because it meant their children would have longer bus rides. The plan was undermined purposefully in some districts. Remember, local officials had to survey and report their own school needs to the Education Finance Commission in Columbia. Some of them built schools for Black children, but underreported the need for space and equipment. In Saluda, for example, a full wing of 12 classrooms was excluded from a school for Black students. In Charleston, one Black high school was closed and administrators refused to build a new one to replace it. This massive resistance became a game of sorts. The Education Finance Commission stopped funding applications for white school projects if the district hadn't also submitted an application for a Black school project. So some school districts, like Lee County, didn't ask for funding for 2 full years after it was available. Other districts responded by applying for funds to build Black schools, but then cut funding for other needs, like local allotments for teacher salaries. Anticipating that the Supreme Court might follow through with overturning separate but equal, Burns followed through on his threat to abandon public schools. In 1952, the legislature put a referendum on the ballot asking South Carolinians to eliminate, if and when the legislature found it necessary, the part of the state constitution that guaranteed public education. The referendum passed by more than 2-1 with almost 188,000 votes cast. You can see the results there, 129,000 plus to 58,000 plus. Of course, the court did overturn separate but equal as public policy in 1954. Burns reacted to the ruling by first halting all equalization building projects and approvals until the state attorney general ruled on the legality of state money going to fund schools that were still designated as Black or white. Then, in a rare personal visit to Gressett's segregation committee, Burns predicted behind closed doors that if the court enforced integration of public schools, white parents would withdraw their children from public schools and enroll them in private schools. Hint, hint. Burns cast this as a concern that if white parents left public schools in droves, then the tens of millions of dollars that had been spent to build new public schools would have been wasted. That was in private, though. In public, Burns continued to promote the equalization program and told South Carolinians that his state would find legal ways to keep public schools segregated. In July, 2 months after Brown v. Board, Burns reinstated the construction projects and the work continued. In fact, Burns and Gressett theorized that if Black parents believed their schools were equal to white schools, they would continue to support segregation rather than integration, so long as they gave the NAACP no reason to pursue additional litigation. For example, avoiding any instances where a Black child would have to pass a white school to go to class each morning, then they believed Black parents would not instigate their word or support more interference by the NAACP. Based on that theory, Burns and Gressett persuaded lawmakers to increase its original bond to $137.5 million, which the legislature approved in 1955, just after Burns was succeeded by Governor George Bell Timmerman. This ultimately funded another $62 million for school construction. This is one illustration based on the work of a graduate student named Rebecca Dabrowski, who did a dissertation on this subject matter, illustrating, it's a partial snapshot, illustrating schools that were built with the first wave of Equalization Act funding by grade level. So you see there on the left, the number of Black schools that were built with that first wave of money, 259, compared to the number of white schools that were built. Here's a similar illustration that shows you how long those first wave funds continued to be used all the way up to 1962. So Burns failed in his primary mission to prevent the Brown v. Board decision, but out of his failure grew good news and bad news. By the time he left office, his equalization plan had allotted nearly $125 million to build 775 new schools. 2/3 of those funds went to build schools specifically for Black students. Under Timmerman, his successor, more of the equalization funds were approved to build white schools, and that pattern continued under Timmerman's successor, Governor Fritz Hollings. By 1963, the amount that had been spent on school construction totaled $214 million. Roughly 54% of that amount went to white schools, 46% had gone to Black schools. More bad news followed. The games that local school boards had played with equalization applications meant that new schools were insufficient to meet the needs. They were overcrowded, they hired too few teachers, and they lacked equipment. In Black school facilities, libraries, gymnasiums, and athletic fields were not equal to those in white schools, nor was the academic curriculum in Black schools, which had been completely overlooked in the equalization plan. I'm going to show you a brief summary of products that came out of the Gressett Segregation Commission. This was draft legislation that the legislature actually enacted. I pointed out to you already that in 1952, they put a referendum on the ballot to eliminate, if and when the legislature chose to, the public schools portion of the state constitution, and that was approved. In 1955, the General Assembly enacted 7 statutory changes. They repealed a parent's right to send his children to school in another county or district when he paid taxes in the other district. They repealed the compulsory attendance law. They provided for a visiting teacher, not a truancy officer, to urge, not compel, school attendance. They granted local school boards additional powers and duties. They repealed the law on school terms, and they gave local school boards the authority to lease or sell school property to private entities in order to allow for the private operation of schools. That last item, number 6, allowing boards to lease or sell property to private entities, would fund a system to give what they called tuition allotments to students enrolled in private schools, $200 a year for a grammar grade pupil, $250 a year for a high school pupil. These private organizations would not be under court jurisdiction, so they could operate their schools on a segregated basis. That was in 1955. This is 2022, and how often do we still hear about tuition allotments or private school tuition payments? Finally, the legislature abolished automatic continuation of employment for teachers. This effectively abolished teacher tenure, but the rationale was it allowed local school boards to avoid liability for canceling teacher contracts in the event that they closed a public school. In 1956, the General Assembly adopted a resolution of interposition, a strategy to halt integration of public schools by having at least 1/4 of states to reject the Supreme Court's ruling in Brown v. Board. In 1960, the General Assembly combined all references to spending state funds for segregated purposes into just one section of the budget bill. This allowed that entire section to be struck with one vote. The act further restricted, or tried to restrict, the federal court's ability to claim jurisdiction in these matters. It required plaintiffs to prove that state laws or courts denied the legislature its authority to eliminate state funding for these purposes before a federal court could intervene. In 1961, the General Assembly enacted a system to award, look at the quotes again, state grants of $200 to parents who chose to enroll their children in private schools. And in 1963, the General Assembly approved, without accompanying appropriations, a tuition grant program to pay private school tuition for parents who opted to enroll their children in private schools. The difference between the 1961 legislation and the 63 legislation is that in 61, the language of the law itself, the language of the statute, made reference to race and segregation. In 1963, they made no reference to race or integration. Instead, they cast it as freedom of choice to parents. When have we heard that lately? Also, the same year the legislature closed all 26 state parks after a federal court ordered state parks facilities to be integrated. In 1964, the state-funded tuition grant program for private schools drew more than 1,000 applications statewide. One of them came from Senator Marion Gressett's brother, Dr. James H. Gressett, to pay for the private school tuition of Senator Gressett's unnamed 15-year-old niece. In 1966, the General Assembly exempted school children aged 14 to 16 from legislation that had just raised the legal driving age to 16 if they drove others to school. This measure allowed students an alternative to riding integrated school buses. I mentioned earlier that Burns discussed with the Segregation Committee his expectation that if integration was enforced, white parents would abandon public schools for private schools. Again, his prediction not only came to pass, but was aided and abetted by legislation from the Segregation Committee. In 1966, the South Carolina Independent School Association was established to accredit brand new segregation academies to qualify for these state tuition grants. It hired a young man named Tom Turnipseed to be its first executive director, and he assisted in opening 43 academies statewide. 22 years later, in 1988, Tom looked back on that work and called it, this is his quote, "a terrible damn thing, the worst of all the racist things I have ever done." Media coverage of the Segregation Committee peters out after 1966. Gressett himself later claimed that the committee was dissolved at his request in the early 1960s, but there's no documentary evidence to support this claim because, and here's the difference between this committee and any other legislative committee, because this committee kept no minutes of its hundreds of meetings. It's unclear exactly when the committee dissolved, sometime between 1966 and 1969. Gressett's own archived papers are a paltry collection. It comprises less than one file box that was scrubbed nearly clean of references to the most important part of his public legacy. In fact, apart from media coverage, the only documentary records that exist of this committee's work, are the 7 what they called interim reports issued by the committee in 1954, 55, when reports 2 and 3 came out in the same year, 57, 58, 59, and 62. In various archives in Columbia and at Clemson University, there are some items of preserved correspondence between and from committee members, but that is all. However, it is not the end of the story for Burns and Gressett. Burns published 2 autobiographies, one in 1947 before his term as governor, the second in 1958 after his term. Do not read either one of these for further illumination on his segregationist ideology. He died in the spring of 1972, only a few weeks before the monument to him was unveiled at the northeastern corner of the State House grounds. Here's a fun fact. The last monument to be placed on the State House grounds before this one was the statue of Pitchfork Ben Tillman in 1940 at a ceremony where the keynote speech was delivered by U.S. Senator Jimmy Burns. Here's another fun fact. In order to put the Burns Memorial on the northeastern corner of the State House complex, they had to bump a statue that was already there It was the memorial to the Confederate women. And they bumped it all the way back to the opposite end of the State House complex, facing now the statue of Strom Thurmond. Gresset survived Burns by a dozen years. In that time, more federal court orders forced the redrawing of Senate district maps, which placed South Carolina State College, now South Carolina State University, in Gresset's district. In '72, the year that Burns died and Tatum Gresset retired as executive director of the state retirement system, Gresset found himself in a world where Black voters' voting rights was now protected by federal law, and in a Senate district that was now 51% Black. That's voting age. If you count the total population, it was 54% Black. For the first time in his political life, to remain in power, he needed Black votes. So to read his public comments from 1972 to 1984, Marion Gresset was the best friend a Black South Carolinian had ever had, ever. Beginning in 1972, media coverage of Gresset's role with the segregation committee also takes a strange, almost gaslighted turn. For years, Gresset had presented himself as the modern John C. Calhoun, the personification of anti-integrationist defiance, the very picture of massive resistance. None was a louder, stronger, more steadfast warrior for permanent segregation in South Carolina, not even Strom Thurmond. But beginning in 1972, the story changed retroactively, and this new narrative would be repeated in every news article that referred to the committee through and after Gresset's death. In this new narrative, his only goal had ever been to give South Carolina time to adjust slowly and peacefully to the coming changes of integration. In this narrative, Gresset and his committee used litigation and legislation to fight the federal government almost as an academic exercise, just to force the government and the courts to cross every T and dot every I. His defenders today point to the lack of violence in our integration process in South Carolina as evidence that Gresset was a visionary hero, not a failed segregationist. In 1979, the Senate honored their failed segregationist hero of the new lost cause by naming its brand new office building for him, where he spent the last 5 years of his life working. Even his death in 1984 is not the end of his story, however, because he passed the torch to yet one more Gresset. To explain this, I need to go back in time once more. 10 years after the 1954 ruling in Brown v. Board of Education, the National Education Association and the All-Black American Teachers Association chose to merge. At the same time, NEA asked all of its segregated state affiliates to merge as well. In South Carolina, that meant the all-white South Carolina Education Association and the all-black Palmetto Education Association, PEA. The two organizations began to negotiate in 1965. They produced a unification agreement in '67. On April 1 of '68, they completed their unification under a title that now included a capitalized to indicate there is one and only the South Carolina Education Association. For the first time in state history, Black and white educators were unified under one banner, one title, in one integrated organization. There were growing pains, but they initiated together an aggressive program to press for improvements in school funding, teacher salaries, and pursuit of a collective bargaining law for educators. In 1972, the NEA established a federal political action committee and issued its first candidate recommendations. In '73, the integrated SCEA did the same. In 1974, the SCEA's 3-day integrated spring convention was attended by more than 5,000 teachers and school district employees, so many they had it at the state fairgrounds. The SCEA's integrated political action committee issued recommendations in dozens of federal and state legislative offices and trained hundreds of Black and white educators in campaigning for endorsed candidates. In 1975, the SCEA hired Joe Grant as its first governmental affairs coordinator. He became the first Black man registered to lobby for integrated educators at the State House. In the spring of '76, the SCEA interviewed candidates and issued recommendations in both the Republican and Democratic primaries. And in May of 1976, after only 8 full years of a unified integrated education profession in South Carolina, a white kindergarten teacher from Orangeburg County, who graduated from the all-female Columbia College in 1970, who had taught for 2 years in Seneca and 4 more years in West Columbia, and who had refused to join the integrated SCEA, convened a small group of white teachers at her home in Casey. And around her dining room table, they voted to establish a new organization called the Palmetto State Teachers Association. In their founding document drafted for that meeting, these white teachers made no mention of race, segregation, or integration. They had read their Lee Atwater. Instead, they cast themselves squarely against collective bargaining for public employees, against political action by educators, and against the unionization of educators in South Carolina. And they elected their 27-year-old hostess to serve as PSTA's founding president. Her name was Elizabeth Gressett Smith. 4 years later, the 1,000+ members of PSTA hired Elizabeth Gressett, no longer a Smith, to serve as their first executive director, a position that she held for the next 25 years. If you track the media coverage of education issues from 1977 onward, you'll find that every time the SCEA issued an aggressive legislative agenda that included higher pay, better benefits, that advocated for more political awareness and involvement by educators, that included collective bargaining rights for public employees, it was followed by old Gressett language in a new Gressett voice, railing against outside influence, demanding higher standards to eliminate less qualified teachers from the classroom, and you should interpret that to mean exactly what you think it means, and giving cover to conservative lawmakers who were not earning the SCEA's endorsements. In fact, it's easy to read the literature and legislative priorities of PSTA throughout its 40+ years as a continuation of the massive resistance campaign, where the integrated SCEA fought constantly for more funding and stronger employee rights and benefits. PSTA has told lawmakers that smarter funding, not more funding, is sufficient, that well-qualified educators don't need stronger rights, and that teachers go into the profession for the personal satisfaction, not for the healthcare and the retirement benefits. Sometime in the late 1970s and 80s, PSTA affiliated itself with a national organization called Concerned Educators Against Forced Unionism. We shared with you a copy of a newsletter that they issued in 2005. This organization railed against NEA specifically and collective bargaining rights for educators generally. When Gressett retired in 2005, CEAFU devoted a full-page article to honoring her and another full-page article to praising her young protege and successor, one Kathy Maness. Maness, only 1 degree removed from the infamous chairman of the State Segregation Committee, and 2 degrees removed from Governor Jimmy Burns himself, is running this year to become State Superintendent of Education. So much for PSTA's principled stand against educators' involvement in political action. And thus, Dr. Green concludes my presentation.
Yeah, I have to say first a big hand of applause to Cecil for that great presentation. I found myself rendered a bit speechless because it once again shows that none of these things happened very long ago. And I think that presentation really illustrated that. What we're going to do now is I want to give Brett some time to introduce Howard Duvall, and then we'll go to Dr. Brown to give her presentation. So Brett, go ahead, please.
Dr. Green, we had talked about having Millicent go next and Howard come in with home rule after Millicent talks about desegregating, which is more in sync with what Cecil had done. And
well, did you want to introduce Howard later then?
Well, I'm certainly going to tell everybody they're here. And we introduced Millicent Brown earlier. For some of you who come in a little later, Dr. Brown is a young and aggressive education agitator for the last 60 years at least. And she was one of the people that integrated the 10th grade in Charleston in 1963. And Millicent's going to talk about those experiences and how far we've come since then. And then we have Howard Duvall, and Howard is somebody that's a legend in the world of local politics. He was the executive director for more than 30 years of the Municipal Association. And those of you that are involved in trying to steer the great ship of state of South Carolina realize that the cities are generally drawing short straws from the people under the dome, and that Howard is certainly well positioned to understand the mechanics of how local government came to the counties. Now, Howard was a municipal manager, but the Home Rule Act is something that directly flows from the problems that we saw or see and continue to see, and the racially biased way that we've unfolded education. And Howard will speak to the way that simply small d democracy is still trickling down upon South Carolina. So we'll get to Howard in a little while. And Dr. Green, encourage people to put questions in the chat. We're going to do questions at the end, sir?
Yes.
Okay. Dr. Brown?
I'm here. I'm ready.
Tell us a story.
Let me just say to everybody that I think you're going to find my presentation quite different. And I hope that being sandwiched in between these two erudite presentations will not be off-putting to you. While I have for over 25, 30 years been teaching the history of civil rights activism, especially in South Carolina, and teaching about school deseg, tonight I have an opportunity to inject into the conversation something that I just feel I, over the years, have been more and more aware of as being left out of the historical discussion. And that is that least we never forget that we're talking about how to bring about serious systemic change on the backs of children. And so while I personally, and perhaps many of you in the class and others have heard of, all of these efforts by groups such as the NAACP to fight, and the history of fighting, changing from equalization to integration and what that meant, and I'm strongly grounded in the need we had from the very beginning to get rid of legal segregation. And I don't apologize for it, but I am so aware that in our teaching of how we transition and argue against what is obviously a white supremacist stance, that the narrative can also almost become a racist narrative, if not by design. And by that, I'm going to just say that it was when teaching, and I've always taught at the college level, but it was in teaching in the 90s that a young student of mine, a young, very talented Black student, I was teaching at Bennett College for Women in Greensboro at the time, came up to me and said, well, Dr. Brown, when you start talking to us about having gone to all Black schools, and then how you told us some of your experiences once you went to formerly all white schools, we think ghetto. And I said, what? He said, when we hear the term all Black, we think ghetto. And I was just absolutely so astounded. I had to really just kind of rethink, and I talked to that student for a while, and I have spent years figuring out, how have we not fully told this civil rights journey in such a way that we have Black students now telling me that oh, the reason for the integration was so that we could go to good schools, and so that we could be taught by white teachers, or that we have to have white students in around us if we're going to get a good education. And I realized in a way that I don't even know how to express it to you tonight, but it was transformative for me, having lived through all that, because no matter how committed my family, my neighbors, my colleagues, and I have always been to the elimination of racial segregation, we never wanted attached to that the inferiority of Black teachers and Black students, and in a larger sense of Black communities. And so I find myself always making sure that while we get the facts of the struggle and the fantastic statistics, and we understand the resistance that that Cecil just laid out so beautifully, and that's such an important foundation for us. We have to make sure we understand that is the resistance side. Some of that resistance actually occurred in Black communities as well, because there were many, many Black families and community members who weren't so sure that the way to equity and equality was to force Black kids into these white situations. And, you know, again, over the years, I've had many years to see myself as both a participant in bringing about that change, for which I am not at all apologetic or ashamed, but I'm just more and more sensitive that if we, meaning us, this group tonight, if we're and educators aren't very careful about how we pose this, it will come off and be continued and misunderstood, that we forget to add that a little quip that I've often used is that make sure you understand that public education didn't have a pot of money from Black taxpayers that went to Black schools and a white pot of money that went to white schools. All taxpayers were paying for the public education system, and Black folks and Black communities and Black children were simply getting the short end of the stick. And so I have always elevated, when I talk about the resistance to integration, I always say, folks, make sure that at the top of the list, we are acknowledging the economic portion, that Black parents were saying, don't make me pay for schools and then my children get the books after they've been torn up and written on and discarded by the white kids. You know, I often used to tell my students, missing the back pages of a book does make a difference. And so our unequal resources is a big part of the driving that must be included when we talk about whether it's the NAACP or any of the other initiatives for integration. Yes, there's that political necessary elimination of segregation, which we had to get rid of. But we cannot, even unconsciously, forget that under-resourced Black schools, and I mean really under-resourced Black schools, were also led and staffed by some of the finest educated Black teachers that there were. Where were all the educated, let's just take in South Carolina, where were all the educated Black people going, since they couldn't, if they didn't go to State College or Claflin or any of the 5 HBCUs in the state, and many of them didn't, they went out of state to other schools or other HBCUs. But the point is, they're coming back to South Carolina and they're teaching in Black schools. And so this notion of inferiority did not get attached to the resources, the facilities, the lack of schoolhouses. That inferiority got tagged onto the Black teachers, the Black principals, the Black children, and their families. And so I just, again, have found over the years how really important it is that as historians and political scientists and educational theorists, we must be very cautious that we add those components as well. Not to apologize for the bad schools, and I'm certainly suggesting that I know there were especially rural communities that were suffering, but even in my own area of Charleston, where if you lived on the Sea Islands, you couldn't get an education past the 8th grade until equalization. It is through equalization that our home, which already was kind of crowded and filled with my sisters and my grandmother and my parents, we always had country cousins from the Sea Islands who had to come to Charleston if they wanted an actual high school diploma. And so when equalization comes along, the beauty of equalization is now kids on Johns Island, Wadmalaw, James Island, and other areas then have a chance to actually go to school. I was asked to speak a few years ago at a program that was honoring the 50th anniversary of the opening up of one of the James Island equalization schools. And I honored, the parents, I honored the children who were coming for this reunion, and the praise they were heaping on their teachers, because those teachers had changed their lives literally by affording them good education and high school diplomas. I became the bad guy because I said, but we must remember why equalization schools were built. And it was really quite astounding and a little surprising, really, to me, that I got some negative pushback, because the history, because it has not been taught in its accuracy, folks out on these islands are saying, thank you for those equalization schools, because without them, we would not have had those high school diplomas or the exposure to those excellent teachers. And so there's this complexity that I'm sharing with you tonight, that I politically understand and have no high regard for Gresset and all of that work. I have lived and seen firsthand what the situation was like prior to those attempts. I just ask people to remember, come on, y'all, the equalizing effort was always done as a way to resist integration. And so we embrace those schools, we embrace those experiences, we love those teachers. We love those teachers more than y'all can ever imagine. To this day, people talk about those fine Black teachers, but at the same time, we just have to round that story out and make sure they understand what the true initiative was for why we had to have equalization. Having made that kind of introductory point, and certainly I'll answer any specific questions that I don't cover later in the Q&A. I'll answer anything. I have been for years about my experiences. But in terms of overview, it's so important that you pay attention to the timeline that Cecil shared with us, because it is in the 50s that parents like my own were trying to, especially after 54, you know, they're trying to make South Carolina follow the Supreme Court. And of course, as you know, South Carolina is saying, you know, hell no, we're not going to do it. My sister, my older sister, was the initial plaintiff, but she didn't start off as a legal plaintiff. We literally started off by going to the all-white schools and asking for transfers, you know, and we were denied transfer papers. Everything from no, we won't give them to you, no, we don't have to we've run out, we don't have any more. You know, come back another day. I mean, the tune changed depending on what school you went to. It depended on whether you were in one city versus another. There was no one way that this resistance was being shown. I found it in the work that you were assigned to read for tonight's class. I found it very interesting, the reference to the Catholic schools, because we had an excellent Catholic school, Black Catholic school here. And I know, in fact, that that was truly what happened. The Catholic schools around here said, you don't have to do it prior to what the state does. And so our Catholic schools stayed segregated until 63, when South Carolina absolutely had to deseg with our case, and they followed suit. But the Catholic schools operated differently in different states. You know, some of them went ahead and just went ahead when they realized the handwriting was on the wall in 54. And in South Carolina, the Catholic schools basically stayed with the public schools and said, we'll do it when we're forced to do it. When we went, when my sister was the plaintiff, an interesting thing happened, that she was, again, this is years that she's trying, she and others, Minerva Brown et al., is trying to make the local schools adhere, hoping that there's some local group that will go against Gressett. And that was not to be the case. But they discovered that she was a rising senior in high school. And the case was then deemed moot. It was decided that there would be no reason for a senior to transfer. And so that would be too disruptive. And so they thought, and this was happening in Virginia and in several other states, once a case was dismissed as being moot, you had to start the procedure, the legal procedure, all over again. And my father took great pride in always referring to me as his ace up his sleeve. He had another daughter, and he was able to go down to the courthouse, and he found somebody who took the Minerva Brown case and simply changed Minerva's name to Millicent. And so the case had to continue. In some cities and some states, that's not the case. They had to actually literally start all over again. But because he had his ace up his sleeve, the court did not dismiss it. There was a ruling, and I apologize for not having the specific name in front of me, but a ruling had been made by this time at the federal level that said if the outcome of the case is to be the same, then you cannot keep throwing cases out. And so whether it was Minerva Brown who went into the school, or whether it was Millicent Brown who, the name of the plaintiff was not the issue. And so we were able to hold on to that as an argument. That this ruling had said the named plaintiff could not be the reason for deeming a case moot. When we went into the schools in '63, the decision was made by Judge Martin. I remember my family and I happened to be vacationing at the time that the ruling was given. And I can remember sort of anticipation. My father was probably a lot happier than I was. I'm not sure I was tuned in yet to what it really was all going to mean. But I knew that I had friends who, even if they weren't named plaintiffs, they were going to transfer with me. I was already at Burke. I had attended ninth grade at Burke High School in Charleston. But through my NAACP connections through my father, I knew people who were plaintiffs in Orangeburg, Columbia, Rock Hill, Camden. We knew that all over the state of South Carolina, there were young children and young cases already ready, just waiting on this decision. And Judge Martin, decided that day that schools would be opening up the next month. He felt that it would have been too disruptive to just open the gates to anybody. And so he then, in his ruling, declared that only the named plaintiffs in Millicent Brown et al. Could go into the schools in 1963. Just to show you from a human angle, I was devastated. I did not anticipate being the only person in my class to go to this school, because I had my friends that were going to go with me. We had all gone through the demonstrations together. We had picketed. We had been arrested together. We had demonstrated. There was a cohort. And so, again, a little human touch to this whole story is that children all over the state, thinking they were going to be let into these schools in '63. Some of us found out that we had to go alone, or we went in these very small numbers, 1 or 2 of us, only in Charleston. I always refer to Charleston as the first deseg in the state of South Carolina. And people always say, Millicent Brown case in Charleston. I do it because I'm trying to draw attention to the fact that nobody was made across the state to deseg until that following year, 1964. And so there were those of us who went into the Charleston schools first, and the others had to wait. Let me just tell you, folks, it makes a difference. By the time think back on your own years in high school, by the time you're in 10th grade, you've kind of gotten connected. And so by the time they were going to allow other Black students in our district and in our area and around the state to go in, most of my friends didn't want to transfer. They had already sought their own identity. Somebody was already the assistant editor of the student newspaper. Somebody was already the president of the student council. And the psychological burden was I was then about to be a junior, and I didn't have anybody coming over to join me because my friends had said, sorry, we were going to, but you know, I'm a Burkite now, or I'm a C.A. Browner, or whatever, a C.A. Johnson, you know. They had already done what young people did. They had already grounded themselves. And so those of us, and we call ourselves first children, those of us all over this nation, but those of us who became the first to go into the schools, then confronted what I feel is left out again of the story of this deseg thing. And that is, how much do we look at the trauma of being young children being asked to change society, to change grown-up attitudes of hatred and talk about white supremacy. I mean, my teachers were astounded when I got good grades. You know, they knew that Black folks were so inferior. And so I had teachers that would just literally look at me with astonishment. And then as others started coming, it was like, this isn't what we were told. This isn't what we thought, you know. we weren't supposed to be getting smart kids over here too, you know. And so there was just a lot of changing and of attitudes, some for the good, some for the good. But it can never be divorced from the story of school deseg. It can't, and I'll put it this way, the way I usually say is, to my poli-sci and my historian colleagues, bring in your sociology, your anthropology, and your educated people as well. Make them deal with the historical reality of school desegregation as well. Because unlike integrating buses, integrating theaters, integrating golf courses, pools, playgrounds, all that stuff that we kind of push together as civil rights and public access, schools are different. You go every day, you go every month, you go every year, you go multiple years. The impact of that is different from going to a theater one night and whether you're able to sit with everybody else. They are all important. But I have been in the past several years appealing to everybody. Let us make a distinction when it comes to this discussion of schools, because we are talking about young psyches, some of whom were devastated. I have those who were in our original lawsuit who will tell me, I cannot talk about it. I will never talk about it. There is trauma there that cannot be changed. Now, that is not to suggest that that means we should not have integrated. Please don't misunderstand my comments. But I am asking that in an age when we use the expression Black Lives Matter, I always say, when we talk about this process, make sure we understand how the psyche of so many children were the psyches were absolutely upended. It is a question worthy of further consideration when you think about who never got played with on those playgrounds, who never got elevated to being whether they were worthy or not, didn't get to be president of the clubs, who never got to wear the crown. These are the things that school and high school is made up of. And when we talk somewhat romantically about those who opened the doors, I just ask that we recall this was more than a political move. It was more than a civil rights move. It also is about psychology, psyches, and mental well-being. And if we leave that part out, then we too are not letting Black Lives Matter. And so I will kind of end my little hoorah with that, because I know if you have specific questions, I will surely address them later. But I find myself at this point in my life realizing that we've done a little bit of a disservice by not always injecting that human element when we talk about the struggle. Thank you, Brett.
Thank you so much for that. That was absolutely fantastic. Really quickly, we're going to get to the Q&A later. We're going to get to Howard Duvall next, but I want to ask you a very quick question.
Sure.
Thinking about your comments that you just given to us, let me ask you this question. And I hope Cecil and Howard chime in on this later on during the Q&A, so I'll remind them of the question later on. But could equity in education have been done more justly? Like, was there a way for it to have been done that would have been fairer to Black students, Black parents, Black teachers than it was done in our reality?
I certainly believe so. I certainly believe so. It would have had to have been precedented on this respect for all children. See, and if the respect and regard that all of these are just children, I think the blocks, the stepping stones we would have used would have always had the children's well-being at heart. There's some communities that, and we were not one of them, South Carolina was not one, but there are some communities that I found out about later in life where instead of always having the Black kids integrated by going to white schools, there were decisions made that sometimes white kids had to go into all Black schools. Okay, so a community that said, yeah, we got to integrate. Yeah, we were forced, but we're doing it in a way that not the same group of people get traumatized, and so we kind of share the grief, if we will. I think that those kinds of measures certainly could have been used. I will also share with you something that I find, if it weren't so tragic, I would almost call it comical. When I was in an all-Black school, Jim Clyburn happened to be in his first year of teaching at my middle school at the time. We called it junior high at the time. We, in anticipation of forced integration and this whole equalization thing was going on, our school got the technology to get some upper level or higher level courses. I believe there were algebra and some kind of a higher level science that was not offered at our school. We got it telecast into our school. And it's through a system that we now know as South Carolina ETV. Now, I'm old. I was, we're talking 1960 or 61 or whatever, when I'm in 8th grade. There was the technology that could have equalized what the children were being exposed to. So that if a school was lacking Algebra 3, for example, that Black school could have gotten Algebra 3 or French 4 or whatever, if we were really hell-bent on equalizing. Now, that didn't say that we don't ever want children to get together. Of course we do. But I am just saying somehow there were some steps that could have been taken that would have not have been as traumatic. And because it was done in South Carolina, this idea of their invading our schools, and that ramped everybody. That's when all the white parents started taking their children out of our school. That was like, we're still running away from this evil thing called Black kids. And so any effort that could have been made to introduce students to each other through exchanges, whatever, both way exchanges, having more maybe teachers of color or white teachers, go back and forth with each other. I just believe that there was a more humane way that we could have found to bring this about, and perhaps not continued this fear of Black kids. Burke School in Charleston in 2022, even in gentrified downtown Charleston, has virtually no white children. That's how long this sentiment of we don't want to be with white kids, the Black schools are inferior. That's how long that sentiment has never been addressed. So the changing of the schools, and you can the demographic shifts, we just keep playing the same circle around the legality. But I don't think we have found ways to address what I think is fundamental. We're still afraid that that to be with Black children is to harm white children. That's a rather extended answer to your question. I'm sorry, but I hope it addresses what you had in mind.
Oh, very much so. That was a great answer, and I think we'll probably pick that up in the Q&A as well. And speaking of which, we want to now turn the floor over to Howard Duvall. We're very honored to have here joining us this evening to talk a bit about home rule and how all this relates together in terms of trying to build some semblance of democracy in the state.
Thank you, Robert. I really enjoyed listening to Dr. Brown's explanation of desegregation in South Carolina and the struggles. And I got the tail end of Cecil's presentation. What I see common to my presentation with the first two that you've heard this evening is that it shows that we've been through several decades of struggle changing our society. We are still in that struggle, and we might be losing the race right now. But let me tell you about home rule, because that's what Brett asked me to talk to you about. And we're only going to have time to hit the high spots on this, but you will note that some of these high spots that I'm going to hit tonight deal with some of the subjects that you just talked about with desegregation and the turmoil in the society of the United States. Let's go back to after World War II in South Carolina, when South Carolina was very much a rural state. You had the boys and a few of the women coming back from World War II. You had the state beginning to industrialize a little bit, but we were still very much a rural state. And at that time, the municipal and county government in South Carolina was very simple. And on the county side, it was a fiefdom of the local senator. The senator, Senator Grisette, down in St. Matthews, and Senator Lindsay wasn't quite a senator when this period was going on, but all of the senators, the 46 senators in the 46 counties, each had a county, and each senator ruled that county as a personal fiefdom. They passed through the legislature each year a budget, just like you've witnessed in the last couple of weeks that's been passed at our current legislature. But it contained what they call a supply bill. And the supply bill was exactly that. It told each county exactly what they were going to get as far as pencils, as far as salaries, as far as personnel, as far as responsibilities, but all of it went through the senator. If the senator didn't want it put in the supply bill, it didn't get there. And if he needed something else, he would have to politic the other senators to get it. So we had a system of government that in 46 counties, which were very rural counties like my county of Chesterfield, and more urban counties like Richland, Charleston, Greenville, each senator ruled their county. Municipal government was much simpler at that time too. We were beginning to develop in municipal government. And we had some authorities, and the state legislature dealt with them occasionally. When I retired in 2008, I went back and wrote a book about the Municipal Association, and which was formed in 1930. And I could see how occasionally we would have an enlightened legislator that would help give some power, mostly fiscal power, to municipal governments to fund the government better than it had. But the governments themselves were very small and didn't require much. But the state began to grow in the late 50s and in the 60s. And when we got to the 60s, all of the problems that Dr. Brown was talking about and Cecil illustrated in his presentation were beginning to form up. It was the 60s were a decade of turmoil all over the United States. And in 1963, we had the assassination of President Kennedy. And following that, you had Lyndon Johnson sworn in on the Air Force One, who's pledged to his Kennedy's widow that he was going to pass the Civil Rights Act and he was going to pass Voting Rights Act. And those things did happen. In 1964, there was a national U.S. Supreme Court ruling on Texas senatorial districts. And in that landmark case, Chief Justice Warren said, legislators represent people, not trees or acres. Legislators are elected by voters, not farms or cities or economic interests. The one man, one vote theory was put into the Supreme Court decision, and it was a sea change for South Carolina. In 1965, we had the Voting Rights Act, and the Voting Rights Act that President Johnson had pledged to the Kennedy family that he would get passed and did get passed, put South Carolina, along with a number of other states, under the federal control for doing anything concerning the right to vote and who could vote. And it also implemented the one man, one vote theory that was espoused by the Supreme Court in 1964. So South Carolina was in a dilemma. You had 46 counties that had one senator ruling the county, and you had different populations in each county. So a vote in Chesterfield County might have higher weight than a vote in Richland County because you had more people in Richland County, but you still only had one senator. So in 1967, the state formed a constitutional study committee. The The Constitutional Study Committee was headed by Lieutenant Governor West, and it was formed with the purpose of trying to get South Carolina ready for the change over to one man, one vote, which would require districts instead of county lines being drawn. You would have to have a House district that was proportional, one man, one vote, and a senatorial district that was one man, one vote. All of this resulted in new political affiliations. The power of the senator was sort of diluted because they no longer had control of the county. So the Constitutional Study Committee had to come up with a system of government to how is the county going to run. They weren't worried so much about municipal government because we were pretty well running on our own. But the 1967 Constitutional Study Committee was trying to form some sort of government that could take over a county, the administration of county government that wasn't controlled by the senator. And so they proposed a constitutional amendment, Article 8 of the Constitution of 1895, which was, as Senator West said, that there were something like 300 amendments to the 1895 Constitution, and it was 10 times longer than the US Constitution, but it had almost no mention of county or municipal government in it. And Article 8 was the vehicle for the Constitutional Study Committee of 1967 getting in place some rules for what would become home rule, county governments and city and municipal governments doing it. Article 8 was voted on in 1972. It was easily passed in the constitutional vote by the people of South Carolina. It was ratified in 1973, the next year after the election. And then it sat there for a couple of years because they couldn't agree on the enacting legislation that would take the words in the Article 8 constitutional amendment and put statutory language to the words of the constitutional amendment so that county government would know how it operated and municipal government would know how it should operate. And so it got to the legislature. The legislature was divided. Two things that municipal government really wanted from the legislation to enact the constitutional amendment Article 8 was we wanted to have more control over the fiscal affairs of municipal government, and we wanted to have better annexation laws so that a municipal government could expand to its normal boundary as municipal services were needed. The municipal government can move out to provide those municipal services, very much like we saw in North Carolina. North Carolina did it right until about the last 10 years, but they allowed their cities in North Carolina to expand. South Carolina, not so much. It got to the point in South Carolina trying to pass legislation to enact the Article 8 constitutional amendment that in the House of Representatives, they dropped completely the sections dealing with municipal government. And they only had county government, and they were giving the county governments essentially the same authority that municipal governments had in South Carolina. And so it went over to the Senate side, and with the help of the investor-owned utilities in South Carolina, not the electric co-ops, we were able to get the municipal section of Article 8 put back into the legislation. The battle was actually between people that had political interest in probably profit interest in one thing or another. The electric cooperatives were opposed to the municipal governments being able to expand because they wanted to control their territory. And the investor-owned, on the other hand, wanted the cities that were where the investor-owned utilities were providing their power. They wanted their utilities to be able to grow as the municipal government goes. So that kind of whipsawed back and forth, hurting the municipal chances for getting good rules out of the legislation. The legislation, the home rule legislation, was approved in the Legislative Act in 1975. And so we had county governments established back in 1960 under the 1975 legislation that essentially had the same rules of municipalities about providing services. And then you had the municipal governments that did not get the freedom to, well, let me back up. It theoretically provided the ability to get more physical authority, but we will see in a minute that that didn't last long. After the 1975 Act was passed, it took some time for county governments to get out of from under the control of the senator and the legislative control, and at the same time, municipal government was growing. Several things happened around in the 1990s that all came together, not in a good way, in the 1990s. Back in the 1950s and 60s, as South Carolina was developing, the property tax system was a mess. Most of the counties did not do any kind of reappraisal of home ownership, what we call 4% property now. Businesses and the industry that was coming in had almost 100% of the taxes put on them. State Chamber of Commerce sued the legislature. The legislature agreed to do a tax equalization plan. It passed in the middle 1970s. It went into effect on 1980. And so at that time, everything was put on the books at its fair market value. It was probably one of the most, the next 10 years were probably the fairest taxation we've ever had in South Carolina, because everybody was paying at their fair market value. It also called for every 5 years to have your property reappraised. The county went through a system developed by the Department of Revenue or the Tax Commission, called back in those days, and they called for putting the property back on the rolls every 5 years at its fair market value. So in the middle 1980s, you began to see people, the counties, running into the reappraisal, and people would see their property taxes go up. And a certain thing happened. The tax commission had the authority to delay reappraisal, and they gave some counties the ability to stop and not do a reappraisal. And one of them was Charleston, another one was Greenville County. And when Charleston was getting ready to do their reappraisal, a little storm came through named Hugo. And so Hugo just made a terrible mess of the ability to reappraise Charleston County. Greenville County went through the same type of situation up there. And then a few years later, when they reappraised, it had been almost 10 years since those property taxes had been put back on the books at their fair market value, and there was a big increase in taxes. So the legislature was all hell bent on stopping local governments from raising property taxes. Okay, you got that going on. On the other side, you've got the Home Rule Act that was passed in 1975. And finally, some of the things that we wanted, the ability to do some fundraising for municipal government, Charleston did. They enacted some hospitality taxes and fees in Charleston, the city of Charleston, and got sued. And the Supreme Court said, well, yes, this 1975 act says that if it's not prohibited by the legislature, then the cities and counties can do it. And Charleston had done it. So that fee, hospitality tax is what they call it, got approved by the Supreme Court. Then there was another case out of Horry County, Brown versus Horry County. The county had put on a $25 road maintenance fee. And Supreme Court said, yes, that's a significant fee, but the county has the authority to do that because the state's not doing it. And if the state's hadn't said you can't do it, then you can do it. And finally, it got down to a big case called Williams versus Hilton Head. Hilton Head had put on a property transfer fee in Hilton Head. And the property transfer fee was put into a pot, and they actually still have it now. They were grandfathered in, that was used to buy up property on Hilton Head to prevent it from being developed so that the island wouldn't be totally congested, and it put in property for the public good. And so the Supreme Court in Williams versus Hilton Head finally came out point blank and said, home rule is the law in South Carolina. And instead of having Dillon's rule, Dillon was a judge, I think in Indiana, but he said you couldn't do anything unless the state legislature said you could do it. Home rule says the other thing. You can do anything unless the state legislature says you can't do it. Well, the state legislature was hell bent on saying that the cities and counties in South Carolina couldn't do it. They were going to protect the property taxpayers. In 1992, all of the Republicans that were running for office and were very successful, they swore that they were going to come back and outlaw property taxes and to control these cities and counties that were going crazy with home rule. Glenn McConnell said he had all the home rule that he could afford in Charleston County, and he was going to stop it. And so we were in a battle from 1992 until 1996 over trying to restrict local governments, county and city, from having any kind of authority that would be called home rule. In 1996, Bob Coble was mayor of Columbia, and he was president of the Municipal Association. And at our fall retreat, Bob Coble called together representatives from the State Chamber of Commerce, from the South Carolina Builders Association, from the legislature, from the Manufacturing Association. There's about 6 or 7 different organizations that he got together at our retreat, and we talked about we needed to find a way out of this. We agreed to go through a facilitated series of discussions over the fall of the year, which resulted in a compromise on local government authority. And it was passed in 1997 as the Local Government Fiscal Authority Act of 1997. It set out the parameters of when a local government, county or city, could raise taxes. It required lots of reports on how you are raising taxes. It limited the amount of taxes you could raise. But on the other hand, it gave us both the local hospitality tax, the local accommodations tax, the local option construction tax that some counties, 1 cent sales tax that they could do certain projects if they voted on it. In Columbia, it's called the penny tax, and it kind of set out a rule. It helped, but it has not stopped the desire of the legislature to reel in the authority of city and counties now. We still see the problem today. It's just as acute, and I think it's getting worse because the people that are elected to the legislature now have no idea about the history of getting home rule, and they only think that the legislature has all the answers, and we see them every year, this year included, doing things that try to further restrict local governments. The state legislature thinks that they know a lot better than the federal legislature and a lot better than the local people. It's only the state legislature that's got the good sense. And so that's kind of where we are. I'm hitting the high spots here, and there's a whole lot that go in between these lines. But home rule is what the state legislature says it is. And we do the best we can with the little bit of authority that municipal governments and county governments have.
Thank you so much for that, Mr. Duvall. Round of applause for Howard Duvall. That was a great presentation and a really important one. And I have to say that I think with the three commentators we've had this evening for our panel discussion, I think the thread that runs through all three of their presentations is whatever the state of South Carolina is deciding to do, if you want good government, do the exact opposite. But I digress. So with that being said, again, I want to remind folks that if you have any questions, please put them in the chat. There are already a few that are there that have been percolating for the last few minutes or so. And I want to get first to Gene Hammock's question. I think this is really for Dr. Brown, but I think anybody could chime in on this one. And I think it's a really important question here, which gets into this. How do we keep, when we talk about school education and the education system in South Carolina, how do we keep fiscal issues versus the social and psychological issues of desegregation in balance today?
I responded to her by saying that I firmly believe personally that had there been a greater emphasis on the importance of providing quality education to all students, and making people understand how that happens, and even a hierarchy of, of needs, like money going to the schools that are most deficient or whatever, It just seems to me that that is a way that back in the day, we could have pressed on towards this whole idea about integration. With today's situation, I'm not sure it's more complex. I just think it's different in that you don't have Black communities defined the same way. And so, residential patterns make a big difference with quality of schools. And so the racial component has gotten whittled down, and we've become very class conscious, about whether the good schools are for those who can afford, So I don't know that I have an answer to her question. All I'm saying is, I think there's another set of questions about what is our end game. What again are we trying to achieve? If we're no longer just trying to make sure that Black folks know white people or vice versa, if we've decided that maybe we'll let folk choose their own um, 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 social networks. Let's see whether or not what the schools do is simply provide some sense of quality and equity to all children. You know, we will find that there's going to be a mixture of who goes to school with who, and because of different residential patterns. You know, I'm just saying, I just think it's another set of questions for today, but it goes back to whether or not we respect that, or can we at least challenge this notion that we really want to educate all children well? Because I don't think that's ever been the ground stage for any of these initiatives.
I think
I'd love to hear if anybody else wants to chime in on that, though.
Yeah, I saw Cecil especially was shaking his head. So Cecil, you want to chime in as well?
No, I think that her last point is absolutely on the mark. That there's been throughout the substance of the presentation I shared with you, there has been not a reluctance, but there's just been an unwillingness, a refusal to consider it a valid public policy that we educate every child, which back in the early 2000s made a little bit of a comedy out of the Bush administration's Leave No Child Behind and the policy that they promulgated in order to put that into effect. Because in South Carolina, it has never been, even today, it's never been the stated policy of the state that we're going to educate every child. We educate the children who go to public schools, who choose to go to public schools, and we give them the education that we choose to give to them. In fact, just 20 years or so ago, the Supreme Court, maybe in the late 1990s, the Supreme Court the state Supreme Court invented this new turn of phrase, minimally adequate education, which is not at all education. When I arrived in South Carolina and learned this phrase 20 years ago, I thought, where have I come to? This is an island out of Gulliver's Travels, that they only want to give a child a minimally adequate education. And hearing Steve Morrison and the team in the Abbeville versus South Carolina case explain the steps that led up to that ruling of the Supreme Court was really eye-opening, and I wish that every South Carolinian could have seen that and heard Steve Morrison and other attorneys as part of that team explain how we got to there, because it illuminates her point, Dr. Brown's point, that we still have not decided as a state to educate every child and to give every child the education that he and she deserves. That's
Dr. Green, let me inject something here before Howard speaks, because a lot of people here don't know that it depends on what zip code you're in. And that has to do with the question of how much money the state's going to put into local governments. And Howard, you know that the two laws, I believe, are local funding law and the Educational Improvement Act, of which the legislature in their wisdom exempts herself from every year. But is it not true, sir, that part of the question on the table about why there's such a disparity fiscally is because the state only puts up so much and the local government has to kick in for local education? And if you live in a poor neighborhood, there you go.
Well, on the education side, Brett, you're right. The Equalization Act, not what is the name of? You said it a minute ago, Brett. For funding
the Education Improvement Act, Dick Riley.
Education Improvement Act is one, but there's two ways they fund school. But let me give you an example. They came out with $100,000 exemption on school taxes in the middle 1990s, and they said you school districts, we're going to exempt on your owner-occupied 4% homes. We're going to exempt $100,000, and we will reimburse you for that. So don't worry about it. We're going to reimburse you. Well, that lasted 2 years, and then they quit reimbursing the school districts, and so the school districts had to eat it. They're doing the same thing now with other school funding sources, based on Act 388. They said we will do away with the we'll take a 1 cent sales tax, and we will do away with the 4% homeowners paying for the school operating budget, and we will reimburse the school districts with this 1 cent sales tax, which they're not doing. They don't. It's not enough money to reimburse it. So the school districts are eating two different formulas there that the legislature never has kept their promise on. On the city side, it's not quite as bad. We had, I think it was 12 funding sources back in 1990 they were local government taxes, but over the course of 20 or 30 years, the state had said, it makes a whole lot of sense for us to collect this tax for you, and we'll send it back to you. And because we can collect it more efficiently. So over the course of several years, the cities agreed to let the state collect the tax. And then they started shaving it off. When things got tight in the state budget, they said, well, instead of sending 100% of what we collect back, let's send 95% of it back. And it got down to about 75% over the course of years. And then I think it was in 1990, Senator Waddell said, we got to come up with a way to simplify this to keep everybody, hold everybody harmless. So we agreed to fund the local government fund, which used to be called aid to subdivisions. The state would keep the money, but in 1990, it represented 4% of the state budget. And so we said, all right, you give us 4% of the state budget each year, and we split it between counties and cities based on how much this county collected in 1990, which was about 83% of that went to counties, about 17% of it went to the cities, and we divide those two pots based on the population, county population to county population, municipal population to municipal population. That came down over the course of the years till when it was about 75% again. And 2 years ago, they changed the formula again. What they did was just wipe out all the unpaid bills instead. Let's start over again. And so they're saying that they will give us 5% of the previous year's revenue. And since that, in those 2 years, they have done that. But you remember this year, they got billions of dollars. So this year, it's not a test case. Let's wait until they get back to the regular budget and see if they keep doing it.
Oh, thanks for that. And I think that's also an example of how I think tonight's lecture could have been titled for all three of our guests here. The devil really is in the details, especially when it comes to local government, to education. Speaking of which, there are a couple of questions in the chat for Mr. Duvall here I think are really important. One of which is the following. Prior to the implementation of the study committee's rules, what was the state of county governments? Were they functional? And was the change limited to local elections, or were some just run by friends of the senator?
I would say most of them were run by cronies of the senator. If you wanted to get a job in the county government, you had to be a friend of the senator. He, and I don't think there were any she's at that time, controlled everything. So county government was mostly road commissioners. They didn't have much. County council members were mostly road commissioners. They had almost no actual authority. And that's one reason that when they shifted to giving the county government the same authority as municipal government, it took 15 or 20 years after that for the old folks to get unelected off the county council, and you get more progressive people into county council that started trying to make progressive moves in services that county government could provide. It was good that grew up into their teenage years in county government and started functioning, but it was bad because it puts them at odds with a growing city like the city of Columbia. We have the municipal governments or service-oriented governments, and we have the ability to serve in populated areas, and they should let us annex. When we annex, we don't take any power away from the county government. We still pay county taxes. They still have county elections, but the good service provider. Now you have to realize I'm kind of biased on this thing, but the good service providers are the municipal governments that have always been providing the basic services: police, fire, planning, recreation, all the things that you expect in a good, well-run municipal government.
And another, I think a good follow-up to that is the local government funding by the legislature is supposed to be 4% of the state budget. How is that currently working?
Well, that was my answer a minute ago. They rearranged it, and they wiped out the IOUs from the past, and they said, all right, from here on, we're going to really give you 5% of our revenue. And in the last 2 years, it's been effect. They have done that. In fact, they increased the funding this year with the billions of dollars that they had to give away.
Right. And I think this is an excellent question as well. This is from Don Murphy. And this actually kind of addresses the entire class up at this point for the entire semester. With respect to Mr. Duvall's lecture, I'm left with the impression that the state legislature has been in an ongoing internecine battle between white supremacists. The dynamic hasn't changed much in 200 years. Little attention paid to Native Americans and African Americans, at the Hispanic Americans, who, by the way, were a majority of the state's population. That's my take. How would Mr. Duvall characterize and address this systemic and intentional negligence?
Is that my question?
Yes.
Well, as I said a few minutes ago, I don't think we're winning this battle. I see Brett chuckling there, but I don't think he thinks we're winning this battle either. What you have now is the people that used to be on the fringe, and you would laugh at them, that they did not have majority support, are now governing us. They get elected because they are good at gerrymandering districts. They get elected because of the money that flows in from dark sources. And so we are being governed by a minority that is able to get elected because of the lots of money that comes in, and because they are appealing to hot button issues that the social media promulgates on the population. I've got a daughter who this year in June will retire at 28 years of school teaching. She is a gifted teacher, just like her mother and her grandmother, but she teaches social science in a York County school district, and she is fed up with it. The parents are listening to Fox News. They are getting their opinions off of social media that's probably got a Russian bot trying to poison their minds. And she is getting out of the education field because those people now control the ballot boxes in a lot of places. And so if you think that the issues that Dr. Brown faced in the 1960s, Dr. Brown, I hate to tell you, but I'm probably 9 years older than you based on when you were in school. But we are not winning this battle, and we've got to do better. I know Brett's out there beating the horses all the time, but we've got to realize that it is at the ballot box that we can change this situation. And if we don't work together. And I know that Brett's thing is called the Progressive Network, but if the progressive people in South Carolina don't stick together and get some progressive minds elected to the legislature, you're going to see a further deterioration in your schools, in your governments, in all of the things that we have fought together for. Let's go back to the 1960s. The people that are progressive, Brett, you want to go back to the 50s?
I want to go back to 1800s.
Oh, okay. Well, I think we started making good positive changes. Maybe not at 1800, but I think if you go back to the 50s, I can see where people in the 50s, the enlightened people that were wanting to do things better. And we probably did not do the integration of our schools in the best manner, but I think there was a cadre of people trying to make changes, and these changes are not easy to make. You've got hundreds of years of brainwashing on us white folks, and you've got hundreds of years of struggle on the Black people in South Carolina. And we've got to figure out this thing together. All of these things work together, whether it's integrating the schools or getting better governments or electing people to our legislature. It's got to be done by people working together to get really good candidates and get them elected.
Right. So I really want to, there's one last question in the chat I really want to get to. So what I'll do now is I'll first remind folks that this Sunday, we are having a special Sunday session on the Orangeburg Massacre, where we'll view the film Scarred Justice, and Cecil Williams will be our special guest for that event. That's open to the public. Please make sure you register as soon as you can. That'll be from 4 to 6 this coming Sunday, May the 15th. And then Monday, May the 16th, we'll have another class on the 60s and 70s. Of course, two very calm and peaceful decades in U.S. and South Carolina history. I'm sure it'll be a very short presentation, not much to talk about from that time period, but we'll be talking about that next week. But to that point, I wanted to close the class out with this question from Greg, because I see this from my students at Claflin as well. They kind of pose this question to me a lot too. And so I want to ask it to all three of our guests this evening, and it'll leave us all with food for thought. Greg wrote in the chat, today Kia Motors of Korea announced it will build a second auto manufacturing plant near Atlanta, hiring 8,000 new workers. I mentioned that news to a former South Carolina government official, and he said if they had come to South Carolina, they would not have been able to find enough workers. Why are there enough workers in Georgia and not in South Carolina? Is it because we keep our workforce undereducated and low-waged? And the follow-up to that, and if so, why is it state policy to keep South Carolina dumb and poor?
Well, I'll be glad to lead off. I think that it's not state policy that we keep South Carolina dumb and poor. I think that South Carolina has done, especially in the industrial area, a very good job of workforce training. And I don't think that there is a state policy that tries to keep people dumb in South Carolina. I think we may have a workforce, a lack of a workforce, but right now, if you look at any industry, from running a city to your any business you want, nobody has enough workers. So that could have the thing about the Kia plant could have been true, that we might not have had enough to provide 8,000 workers. One of the comments we had a while ago on education was that, Cecil, what did you say? I can't remember how you said it, but it was that we did have a problem because of the minimum,
Oh, minimally adequate education.
the
Absolutely.
minimum adequate
Yeah.
education. I think we got a long way to go, but on getting our educational quality up. But there again, the people that determine our education are the people we elect.
I would add to, I'm sorry, Dr. Brown, go right ahead.
My comment was going to be very, very brief. It has to do with, and I don't think, again, it's state legislated. However, I think it's pervasive throughout all of our institutions that we're still fighting an us-them kind of mentality. And it seems to me that a robust industrial life, educational life, and even social interaction life is going to have to be built upon some elimination of this if they win, I lose kind of mentality. And I think that's what comes off as, we don't want to extend really good education to everybody, because that means my kid might not get into Clemson. There aren't but so many seats. I think that somehow this fear mongering through the centuries is eating at us and continues to. The idea that if some of us succeed, then that takes away from others of us. And I don't know a direct way to address that, but I believe that that's sort of the undergirding for so much of the David and Goliath kind of adversarial ideas that seem to float through all of our institutions. And you talk about unity, but we know that behind it, and yes, a lot of it is racial and ethnic, but it's also class. It's just this idea that we don't really believe that we want everybody in this thing together. And so policies that appear to benefit folks that aren't like us, then we just rather reject. I feel, again, somewhat sentimental about it, but I remember closing down all the county parks rather than integrate. It's like this whole thing of we will punish ourselves before we will extend that privilege to other people. And something about that just always, to me, is at the basis of what this person's comment is all about.
My comment is this. I understand and appreciate that Howard discounted the premise of the question, that it's state policy to keep South Carolina dumb and poor. But I would accept the premise of the question to a degree. When we consider that South Carolina itself was founded on a perfection of the plantation system, and it has never, never, never given up the notion of perfecting the plantation system. The early plantations of the state were run by, obviously, pre-capitalist or capitalist aristocrats and their offspring, their progeny. I would say today that South Carolina continues to be owned and operated by an evolving economic aristocracy. You could call it the top 1%, the top 1/10 of 1% if you want to, but there's plenty of money in South Carolina. There are plenty of wealthy people in South Carolina. You have only to go into every single county's country club, and there they are. They live in the houses around the golf courses at the country club. That's where the money is. They are the evolving economic aristocracy of the state who own and operate the legislature for their purposes. This, in fact, goes back to Don's question a few minutes ago of what explains the systemic neglect. It isn't just that we continue to elect people who sustain this perfected perfected plantation system in the state. It's that they created in the Constitution of 1895 and reaffirmed in the amendments of 69 a system that keeps everything in the state. In fact, Howard's presentation is all about this. Keeps everything in the state under the thumb of the legislature. The judiciary of South Carolina is a wholly owned subsidiary of our legislature. The governor's office of South Carolina, whoever sits in that office, is a wholly owned subsidiary of the state legislature. So we are not just electing a cacistocracy, a government by the least capable of governing, but we live under a systemic cacistocracy in that our Constitution doesn't allow for anything else except this constant rejuvenation of an old and malicious, malevolent system. As to why it's state policy to keep us dumb and poor, I think that Greg may have answered part of the question himself in the earlier part of his question. Is it because we keep our workforce undereducated and low waged? Absolutely yes. When talking about this evolving economic aristocracy, I include in that a century or more ago, the textile magnates who came into South Carolina from up north and bought these bankrupt textile mills for a song because they came in after the Depression and everybody was out of work. They bought up these textile mills and of course produced what they could on the backs of and the skin and bone and blood of poor people who needed jobs coming down out of the Appalachians. In the deep dive that we did around the uprising of 34, our guest lecturer discussed that in greater detail. But following the textile revolution of the 30s and the 40s, when the managers not took over, but tightened their grip on us, keep in mind, there were advertisements in national publications, in national trade publications, asking businesses to come to the South and South Carolina particular because we had cheap labor. They didn't mince words because they used the language because we had cheap labor. You didn't have unions negotiating contracts down here like you did up in the northeastern states. So y'all come down here and you can make all your profits for pennies on the dollar. Then Saul Blott in 1953, in the legislature of 1953, that passed the right to work law. Why? Because other southern states were passing right to work laws and we wanted to compete, by God. When I said I would accept the premise of the question to a degree, I would also say that it's South Carolina's policy to keep us docile and dumb and poor, because they do want us to work. They do want us to be productive, not be out in the streets, not protesting at the State House. They want us, by God, to go to work in the morning and punch our time clock and earn our minimum wage, whatever that is, under $15 an hour, and go home at the end of a long, long day and too tired to protest what they are doing to us. I had another thought to add to that, but that might need to be the end of my rant. It's docile and
Dr. Green, I want to get in on beating up Howard.
I'm sorry, I did have a footnote, and thank you, Brett, for reminding me. Howard, when you mentioned that South Carolina has done an excellent job of technical education, of job training through public schools, that was not the role of public schools for decades and decades and decades. It's when the business, that evolving economic aristocracy, discovered that, you know what, all that money that we spend on job training, the money we spend on training up brand new employees, giving them on the job training, we could keep in the profit side of our ledger if we just outsource our job training to public schools. And that's what they have done. In 2003 or 4, I was sitting in a House subcommittee, education subcommittee, and heard a fellow who was a Bojangles franchisee, I forgot his name, it was a funny name, came and testified to that subcommittee that, by God, we need to invest more in job training because he had brand new employees who did not know how, this is a Bojangles franchisee, who did not know how to do simple math, he said. So therefore, you need to do job training, not in community college or technical college, because they ain't going there. You need to do job training in 8th grade, 9th grade, 10th grade, 11th grade, so that by the time they come to me for a part-time job in the 10th grade, et cetera, they know how to punch the picture of a chicken leg on my cash register or a bowl of rice on my cash register, and I don't have to worry about them screwing up the math. I'll stop there.
And Howard is not going to defend the circumstance, but I've got to say that he remembers the Golden Goose campaign by the State Department of Commerce. I got off an airplane one time in LaGuardia, probably Carroll Campbell was probably governor. There was this giant poster of this guy in a hard hat with his wife beater, dirty t-shirt on, side profile. He looked like he was pregnant. He had a daisy in his mouth. The caption was, South Carolina has no labor pains. The pitch to New York people getting off airplanes from all over the world, South Carolina has the lowest number of work hours lost due to labor disputes. Y'all, and we have no environmental laws. Y'all come on down. And this is not ancient history. It is actually ancient history brought forward because we're still operating under the same premise that brought us a government that is designed on the repression of people of color, because that's the way you manipulate the white working people so they think it's the black people that's the problem instead of the rich white guys. Whole story. Dr. Green, I'm going to be quiet now if you want to facilitate some questions, or you can leave.
I was going to go ahead and just close this out for the evening, but I will say this. I think tonight's presenters have all presented a compelling case for why institutions like the Modjeska School matter so much, because it gives us a place to talk about these issues. The irony of me saying that is, I remember right after last week's class came to an end, it was revealed that the Supreme Court was seriously considering repealing Roe versus Wade. And that was, to be honest, a blow to me when I saw that right after teaching a grade Modjeska class. I thought, well, we've got a lot of work to do. And I've been teaching this class since 2019. I'll leave you with this. It seems every year that I teach this course, the lessons of the class, the lessons of fighting for a truly equitable and fair and just South Carolina become more and more and more relevant. 2020, of course, we had the pandemic. In 2021, we had the attempt to overthrow the federal government. This year, we are seeing so many more examples of how these things are not just affecting South Carolinians, but the entire country. And it is up to all of us to find some way to say to ourselves, to our kids, to their kids, that we're going to give these folks help. And we're going to keep fighting no matter the cost, because the stakes are too high for any of us to do otherwise.
Thank you, Dr. Green. And thank you, Howard. And thank you, Dr. Brown. And thank you, Cecil. And those of you that want to stay and like unwind here, we can let the grown-ups go home and we'll stay and conspire. But thank you so much, Dr. Green. You can have supper, Howard.
Okay. Thank y'all.
We're going to get you back now. We're going to work on you, brother. Thank you for coming.
Thank you, everyone.
Good night, Dr. Green.
Good night.
I do need to go. I'll talk to you later, Doctors Brett, Hammock, and the rest.
Cecil, it was good. Thank you so much.
I enjoyed this. Thank you for the invitation. This was terrific. I'm
gonna stop the recording and we can get down and dirty here.
Gotcha. Talk to you later.
And you are still in Florida?
I am. In fact, my connecting flight was through Washington, D.C. today. So I was in D.C. today for the first time in more than 2 years.
Oh, Lord.
And they took me to, if